Okay. Well, we got to get back to business here. Our next speaker was a lover of Chesterton. I guess before I was Father Scott Caton. That's when he was Scott Caton. He was teaching a course on Chesterton, as a matter of fact, at Roberts Wesleyan University. Go figure. He also taught courses on Newman, too, at Roberts Wesleyan University. Anyway, but when as Scott, he came to our Chesterton Society early on. He brought an enthusiasm and a bunch of wild, crazy people, and just a real joy for Chesterton, including he brought in Father Julian Phelan, of all people, if you remember Father Julian Phelan. God bless him. Anyway, so as Scott, he was an early member and a very supportive member. He is now a priest. And I want to talk about that a little bit, tell that story, and I asked Father Scott's permission to do that, and he knows me, so he knows this could go anyway, and it might not be good. You know, the church, we love the church, right? But the church is fundamentally, has part of it that's very human, and it's a big bureaucracy, you know. I mean, it's the, you know, the oldest bureaucracy going, as Mr. Higby will say. You know, you recall that story, the journalist who sees the Vatican and is wandering around and sees all these wonderful things, and finally gets his chance to interview John the 23rd, and so he says, Your Excellency, whatever you call the Pope, oh gosh, you know, how many people would you say work here in the Vatican? And the Pope says, I don't know, maybe half of them. Anyway, you know, the church is a big bureaucracy. Well, a number of years ago, Scott Caton had the call to the priesthood, and I mean, you know, he's this is a little bit crazy. As many of you know, he's a father of a family, but he also fits in under this sort of what I call casually the Anglican exception. Did I say that okay? Is it? It's not the Anglican exemption, exception, whatever it is. So he gives it a try because what the heck, you know, the church is So he files all his papers and gets everything together and works with the diocese, and you know, and all his stuff goes to Rome for approval. And you know, the cardinal in charge of that says, "Well, Rochester, I don't hear a lot of good things about Rochester. But everything seemed to be in order, and this seemed to be an unusual case. So he allowed it. He signed it. And said, "Okay." You know, it provided certain steps were taken. Over the next few years, Scott took those steps and was ready for ordination. But to get ordained under this exception, your papers have to go to the Pope. So his papers, everything's all set up. They go to the Pope, and the Pope looks over everything. He sees the signature of the cardinal that approved this whole thing. He was kind of in a bind, one of those bureaucratic binds, because he couldn't exactly call Cardinal Ratzinger in there to explain this whole case. He was Cardinal Ratzinger. He was kind of insane. Anyway, that's sort of the gist of it, isn't it, Father? it's somewhat the gist. I flavor it a little bit just to tease Father Scott because we all love him so much. He's an apt person for the topic that he's going to talk about, which is Chesterton's dealing out apologetics with charity. I'm just so pleased to introduce Father Scott Caton.
I know it's after lunch, but I always teach a 2 o'clock class, so I'm used to people falling asleep and everything. You don't offend me in the least. The book of Sirach, in chapter 11, has the following lines in verses 26 through 28. For it is easy for the Lord on the day of death to repay mortals according to their conduct. A time of affliction brings forgetfulness of past delights. At the end of life, one's deeds are revealed. Call none happy before death, for how they end, they are known. On the day of Gilbert Chesterton's funeral, June 24th, 1936, 10 days after his death, England and the world gathered up and collected the ways he was known, for he had reached his end, and his deeds were revealed in the sense that they were beginning to be put into context for the world. Pope Pius XI instructed his Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pius XII, to write 2 telegrams on his behalf for the funeral, one for Frances Chesterton, GK's widow, and the other to Archbishop Hinsley, who was then the Archbishop of Westminster. The telegram to Hinsley was read out loud at Westminster Cathedral at the funeral. In it, Chesterton was referred to as, quote, a gifted defender of the Catholic faith, unquote. As Father Ian Kerr, in his great recent biography that Lou showed us, that's up for bidding, or up for, raffling. As Father Ian Kerr, in this recent biography, remarks, no one would have been more amused than Chesterton to be thus associated in death with Henry VIII, who before his break with Rome had been given the title Defender of the Faith. And Ian Kerr notes in his biography, because the Pope had conferred what was traditionally a royal title, Defender of the Faith, on a subject of the realm of England, the secular press did not print the telegram in full because of that. It's interesting. Defender of the Faith, in other words, an apologist. In death, this was his title given to him by the Pope. The great modern Lutheran apologist, John Warwick Montgomery, who is presently the director of the International Academy of Apologetics and Evangelism and Human Rights in Strasbourg, in France, once gave an address at Patrick Henry College, where he was then the distinguished research professor of philosophy and Christian thought. And that address later appeared in the Protestant journal Christian History. In that address, entitled Chesterton the Apologist, Warwick Montgomery says, at heart, Chesterton was a controversialist, or better, an apologist. What he really wanted to achieve was to bring his contemporaries and us back to sanity by showing the truth of classic Christian orthodoxy. And then this is going to be a rather long quotation from Montgomery that keeps going for a few minutes from this article. True, he seems to discount his apologetic role. In one of his most important books, Orthodoxy, he claims that he is doing spiritual autobiography, not apologetics. He goes so far as to declare, quote, I never read a line of Christian apologetics, unquote, one of his famous lines. But in effect, this put him in the same category of originality as Wittgenstein, who refused to read traditional philosophy at all and thereby created something truly original himself. And then Montgomery goes on to say, the proof of the pudding in Chesterton's case is the influence he has had on contemporary and subsequent defenders of the faith. He goes into a whole list of, you're a good apologist if you influence apologists. It's kind of an interesting point. And as you may know, H.N. Gilson, the great medievalist, said a lot of things about Chesterton, but one of the things he said was that Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy, that you just purchased back there, was the best apologetic in the 20th century, or that the 20th century had yet produced as of that time that Gilson wrote that. When Chesterton died, Charles Williams of the Oxford Inklings lamented, the last of my lords is dead. And in his obituary to Chesterton, which is not all praise, T.S. Eliot stated flatly that Chesterton, quote, did more than any man in his time to maintain the existence of the Christian minority in the modern world, unquote. I'm going to cut a couple of quotations out in the interest of time. But anyway, in this address and in this later article, Montgomery draws out two very important aspects of Chesterton's apologetic: his concern for facts and his genuineness. And here is what Montgomery says about the genuineness. I'll just choose this quotation. "It has been frequently said that one's life speaks so loudly that it is difficult to hear what one is saying. In the case of some apologists for the Christian faith, their lives have been so unattractive that their arguments have not been taken seriously. In evangelical circles, the problem has often been one of sanctimonious pietism. The spokesperson for the gospel has been so legalistic and negative that the lifestyle represented has repelled the unbeliever. For example, by majoring in minors and insisting on blue laws, the evangelical has given the impression that to become a Christian, one must first give up alcohol and tobacco and theater and so on. When faced with this personal and ecclesiastical style, the unbeliever has not infrequently found it difficult to listen to what may well constitute sound apologetic arguments for the faith." Chesterton never fell into this trap, Montgomery says. He had a strong doctrine of creation and saw the beauties and pleasures of this world as gifts of God, which we've heard from the two previous speakers this morning. A strong aspect of his apologetic was his criticism of pietistic legalism. He devoted, for example, an entire novel to the absurdities of prohibition, and then Montgomery talks for quite some time about the flying in, where this Muslim prime minister is elected in England. That could never happen. A Muslim prime minister is elected in England, and all the inns and pubs are abolished in consequence. You've read the book, I'm sure, creating a situation paralleling prohibition in America. And then the same evils arise on the other side of the water in England as in America: bureaucracy, crime, and the general increase of social problems. And the happy-go-lucky creators of this flying in, this cart that's carted around, it's a pub that moves around, just ahead of the authorities. These creators have what Montgomery calls a relaxed openness which characterizes believers confident in the world in which God has placed them. Chesterton himself, Montgomery says, enjoyed cuisine and wines. He dressed idiosyncratically and sometimes eccentrically. He understood the scriptural emphasis on the unique importance of each individual before God and hated all bureaucratic and totalitarian attempts to enforce conformity. He was the polar opposite of the Pharisee, and there is little doubt that his transparent genuineness served as a vital reinforcement for the persuasiveness of his formal apologetic arguments. That's Montgomery. It's this aspect of the personal character of Chesterton as apologist that I would like to pursue today in my remarks, and which Lou asked me to talk about, following up on what Montgomery had mentioned in this article. And this is because there are two aspects of a Christian apologist: the aspect of the man as a writer and the aspect of the man as a personality, as a character. There's no way to explain Chesterton's success as an apologist for the Christian and for the Catholic faith without highlighting his charity and his kindness and his humility and his joy, which again have been touched on already today. These traits are really the only things that can explain the likes of H.G. Wells having said, "If I ever get to heaven, presuming there is a heaven, it will be by the intervention of Gilbert Chesterton." This is what that comment of H.G. Wells is what Father O'Connor heard reported to him on the day of Chesterton's Mass that I referred to. And Ian Kerr, in his biography, remarks that a couple of years earlier, H.G. Wells had told Chesterton, "If after all my atheology turns out wrong, and your theology turns out right, I feel I shall always be able to pass into heaven, if I want to, as a friend of GKC." And it's interesting what Chesterton said in reply to that. Just think if somebody said that to you. And in reply, Chesterton assured Wells that if he, Chesterton, turned out to be right, if he was right, Chesterton didn't say, "Well, you'll see." He said, "Well, if I'm right, then you, Wells, will triumph not by being a friend of mine, but by being a friend of man. Wells had added, after that bit about his claiming friendship with Chesterton as a defense so that Wells could get to heaven, Wells added, Chesterton defended the truth with an extraordinary personal kindness. An extraordinary personal kindness. Why is this extraordinary personal kindness so important in Chesterton's apologetic method, and why did Chesterton exude it, and how did he exude it? Well, you know and I know, it doesn't take me to tell you this, in an age when one ideological camp is so utterly quick to demonize the other ideological camp, politically and in other ways too, in an age so lacking in what the Protestant Fuller Theological Seminary president Richard Mao, in his excellent 1992 book called Uncommon Decency, in an age which is so lacking in what Mao calls Christian civil discourse. The exemplary gift that Chesterton gives us in his apologetics is the gift that H.G. Wells put his finger on so well, Chesterton's extraordinary personal kindness. This kindness was not based just on Chesterton's personality alone. It was based on a thoughtful understanding of the nature of Christian apologetics in the early 20th century, from figuring out what the culture is doing and figuring out how he's going to maximize his effectiveness as an apologist. This is true when we think of apologetics as a defense of Christianity in general over against non-Christian ideologies, and also a defense of Catholicism in Chesterton's life to those who are not Catholics. First, Chesterton moved in circles in which very, very smart and accomplished people came to very different conclusions about religious ideas. This was something, if not new in Europe, it was pretty much on the cutting edge. The whole 19th century is this move towards this kind of diversity in intellectual thought. Before that, you pretty much have intellectuals thinking in Christian terms at least, and now it's just kind of going wild. But I think when you read Chesterton, when you think about him, he's always moving in these very high circles. He's a humble man, but he moves in very high circles. There was this passage I just read recently in his autobiography where he kind of offhandedly says, I can't remember the exact setting, but he had gone to some dinner where they were filming things, and it was very unusual to see a person there with an actual camera to film, motion picture film. And then he said, Chesterton says in his autobiography something like, I turned to my guest at the table and said, what are they doing? And he said, and Edward Elgar said, well, they're filming us. It's like he's just kind of like with all these people, like Elgar and Wells and Shaw and so on and so forth. He moved in these circles, and he was accustomed to this phenomenon of very smart and accomplished people thinking totally different things about religion and philosophy. And he seems to me constantly to echo a line of Cardinal Newman's in Newman's Apologia. It's in chapter 5. Be large-minded enough to believe that men may reason and feel very differently from yourselves. How is it that men, Newman says, when left to themselves, fall into such various forms of religion, except that there are various types of mind among them, very distinct from each other? Well, interestingly, there's a statement of Chesterton's to this very effect that even mentions Newman himself. Chesterton writes, it did not seem to occur to some controversialists that if Cardinal Newman was really a man of intellect, the fact that he had adhered to dogmatic religion proved exactly as much as the fact that Professor Huxley, another man of great intellect, found that he could not adhere to dogmatic religion. That is to say, as I cheerfully admit, it proved precious little either way. If there is one class of men whom history has proved especially and supremely capable of going quite wrong in all directions, it is the class of highly intellectual men. Thus, for Chesterton, the party spirit concept of argumentation doesn't really work. Like, so-and-so believes this, so it verifies it. You know, some great scientist isn't a believer in God. That means that we shouldn't believe in God. And Chesterton never uses that kind of party spirit strategy. The church can put up just as many intellectual men and women who believe in the dogmas of the church as the world can put forward men and women, intelligent as they are, who disbelieve. And this is why gathering into these militant camps, which is the phenomenon of modern culture, is not helpful apologetically, and Chesterton saw that. But just because different people believe very different things, that does not and should not breed intellectual skepticism, which it does in some people when they observe this phenomenon. Instead, it does and should breed humility for the Christian apologist, a humility that leads to kindness. That very smart men and women have what they believe to be their reasons for rejecting Christianity or rejecting the Catholic Church means that Chesterton and any good apologist can cheerfully enter the fray, because a Christian apologist can hold his or her own also. The presence of smart contemporaries who believe other things is not a subtle invitation to shut up and keep quiet, but it's an invitation, and Chesterton saw this, to participate wholeheartedly in the civil discourse necessary for a Christian apologist in the 20th century and also in the 21st century. And Chesterton, as in many things, showed us the way here. We are all, it is hoped, looking for what is true, even if Chesterton's friends like Wells and Shaw didn't believe necessarily in ultimate truth or in absolute truth. They ostensibly believed in relative truth, and relative truth for Chesterton was always a start. He didn't approve of the concept of relative truth. He has those famous lines, you know, what's true on Monday, what is it not true on Wednesday? It's true, if it's true on Monday, it's true on Wednesday. He didn't believe in the idea of relative truth, but relative truth for Chesterton was an apologetic strategy of starting. For Chesterton, at least the quest for even relative truth, even a smidgen of relative truth, could help us, for the moment anyway, to see that in one sense we're all on the same page, disagreeing though we are over very, very fundamental points. We all remember this famous passage from Orthodoxy, but I want you to think about it in terms of apologetics. Here it is. Mysticism keeps men sane, he writes. Think of what Father Wilde said earlier today. As long as you have mystery, you have health. For when you destroy mystery, you create morbidity. The ordinary man has always been sane because the ordinary man has always been a mystic. He has permitted the twilight. He has always had one foot in earth and the other in fairyland. He has always cared more for truth than for consistency. If he saw two truths that seemed to contradict each other, he would take the two truths and leave the contradictions along with them, and the contradictions along with them. For Chesterton, truth is so important that he himself will take it where he finds it, even if it seems to contain inherent contradictions or suggests contradictions. And here's the point of how this is used in his life apologetically. Chesterton simultaneously, because of this infectious love for the truth, was able to come alongside skeptics or non-Christians, non-Catholics, whatever, pointing out their own truths and commending them for holding certain truths, saying in effect all the while, keep holding on to truth wherever you find it. I think in some ways you might be inconsistent in holding some of these truths, but truth is always a challenge. Even in the Catholic Church, there is a lot of mystery, and we have to hold seemingly contradictory truths together. But in his later life, he said, the Catholic Church does hold all of these truths together, and as if he's talking to these people, you'll see, don't worry, the more truths you hold, the more Christian and eventually the more Catholic you will become. It's this encouraging kind of coming alongside the person saying, you've got these truths, we're gonna major on those and work with those and see how these truths shake out. In this way, his apologetic, especially for those Christians who are outside the fold of Catholicism, is very warm and welcoming in addition to being humble. And this is the spirit that comes across in countless ways in Chesterton's writing and in his person as extraordinary personal kindness, as well said. This kindness is a reflection of the additive idea of truth, of course. As Newman said so well in a great passage when Newman was still himself a Protestant. Here's Newman's lines. I say then that never to have been troubled with a doubt about the truth of what has been taught us is the happiest state of mind. And if anyone says that to maintain this is to admit that heretics ought to remain heretics or pagans pagans, I deny it. For I have not said that it is a happy thing never to add to what you have, but that it is not happier to take away. Now, true religion is the summit and perfection of false religions. It combines in one whatever there is of good and true, severally remaining in each. And in like manner, the Catholic creed, he means as from an Anglo-Catholic point of view, the Catholic creed is for the most part the combination of separate truths which heretics have divided among themselves and err in dividing. So that as a matter of fact, if a religious mind were educated in and sincerely attached to some form of heathenism or heresy, and then were brought under the light of truth, it would be drawn off from error into the truth, not by losing what it had, but by gaining what it had not. Not by being unclothed, but by being clothed upon, that mortality may be swallowed up of life. That same principle of faith which attaches it to its original human teaching would attach it to the truth. And that portion of its original teaching, which was to be cast off as absolutely false, would not be directly rejected, but indirectly rejected in the reception of the truth, which is its opposite. True conversion, Newman wrote, is of a positive, not a negative character. Everyone deep down is on a journey for more truth in some way. It may not look like it, but the quest for truth is there, however hidden, however repressed. This helps the apologist come alongside those against whom he might be vigorously arguing. It helps the apologist say, we and not just you. Look at Chesterton's writings sometime and see how many times we is used in an apologetic sense. It's very interesting. The we means for Chesterton, we have truths to share. Let these truths lead us on to bigger truths. We have truths that seem contradictory. Well, let's shrug our shoulders in a way and continue to seek for truth together. I'm no better than you because I think I may have more truths, and truths that perhaps seem more coordinated as they are in Catholicism. Indeed, free will is a mystery, and it's all of grace. In fact, for Chesterton, in the apologetic method he uses all the time, free will is there with grace, and the more we recognize the idea of free will, as Joseph Pierce said today, the more we recognize the idea of free will, the more sensitively we recognize grace. If facts support Christian orthodoxy, if facts support the Catholic Church, there is nothing to fear. There is no reason to become personal enemies with anybody. I read recently Father Wilde's a section of Father Wilde's book on Chesterton and the demonic. And I just wanted to read this one quotation of his, with his permission. This is Father Wilde. Talk about paradoxes. The existence of the devil and his temptations is one of the factors behind G.K.'s celebrated charity towards his intellectual foes, towards everyone really. He believed that erroneous ideas affected moral behavior, and often people were not aware that their ideas were erroneous. Maybe people were supercilious because they were theosophists, not theosophists because they were supercilious. We could prolong this list indefinitely. Maybe people are grouchy because they harbor pessimistic ideas, not pessimistic because they are grouchy. Maybe people are sad and unpleasant because they have fatalistic and harsh ideas, not harsh because they are unpleasant people, and so forth. The devil is the father of lies, as Jesus said. If you believe that Satan is alive and active, tempting people with lies, you will be more charitable and compassionate. You will not be attributing all evil to them. If we do not believe in the devil, we naturally attribute all the evil in human beings to those human beings alone, and regard many of our fellow creatures as fiendish originators when they are only tempted or tormented victims. Nobody can doubt that there are things in the world that can only be called devilish, and to say that there are no devils is really to say that human beings are devils. That's Father Wilde. George Bernard Shaw described Chesterton in these terms. One of his famous statements about Chesterton: friendly, easygoing, unaffected, gentle, magnanimous, and genuinely democratic. Shaw, according to Lawrence of Arabia, who talked about Shaw, and this is quoted in Maisie Ward's biography, and I think also in Ian Kerr's, Shaw always called Chesterton a man of colossal genius, and it was Shaw's love of the life of the mind, of the intellect, of the searching for facts, really, that bonded him to Chesterton. When Chesterton's great book on St. Thomas Aquinas came out, that we heard Father Hetzler talk about, George Bernard Shaw reacted with glee. Great news this, he wrote to Chesterton's wife Frances, about the divine doctor. I have been preaching for years, Shaw says, that intellect is a passion that will finally become the most ecstatic of all the passions. And I have cherished Thomas as a most praiseworthy creature for being my forerunner on this point. In other words, with the search for truth underway, along with his fellow man, Chesterton could afford to be truly humble in his apologetic. And this, along with his keen understanding that great minds often do not think alike, freed him up to be magnanimous, to befriend those so opposite to him on the ideological scale that really it's truly mind-boggling. In his writings on Shaw, in Chesterton's writings on Shaw, he certainly did not hold back in the criticism of Shaw's ideas, but he constantly brought the reader around to seeing, you can see this in every one of his statements about Shaw, he brings the reader around to seeing one or two large flaws in Shaw's reasoning, flaws from Chesterton's point of view, flaws within great layers of insight and great layers of humor and great layers of truth, and then sought to show the reader how Christianity answered these great flaws. For example, Shaw's evolutionism, his particular version of evolutionism, and Father Kerr points this out in his biography, Shaw's evolutionism was rooted in a despair about man. And this is what is picturesquely symbolized, Chesterton writes, Kerr's quoting Chesterton, this is what is picturesquely symbolized by a rather vague and evasive enthusiasm for Shaw about the Superman, the Übermensch. The Shavian evolutionist really did want to cast the whole body of man, Chesterton says, into chaos, into the melting pot, and boil it into nothing, that a new and superior something may at last emerge. Christianity, on the other hand, Chesterton says, is the only one and great philosophy that has refused to despair of man. And with Wells, we see Chesterton's apologetic method coming out also in a very positive way, especially in Chesterton's great work, The Everlasting Man, which, as you know, is a sort of apologetic answer to H.G. Wells's The Outline of History. In Chesterton's great introduction to The Everlasting Man, he writes on this positive apologetic method. The trick, he says, Chesterton says, is to invoke the imagination that can see what is there. This is what both Father Wilde and Joseph Pierce talked about this morning. When Christianity's fundamentals are doubted, as at present, we must try to recover the candor and wonder of the child, the unspoiled realism and objectivity of innocence. We must try at least to shake off the cloud of mere custom and see the thing as new, if only by seeing it as unnatural. Things that may well be familiar so long as familiarity breeds affection had much better become unfamiliar when familiarity breeds contempt. The heavy bias, Chesterton says, of fatigue made it almost impossible to make the facts vivid because the facts are familiar. If, for example, one has lost the sane vision of who man is, then one can only get it back by something very like a mad vision. That is, by seeing man as a strange animal and realizing how strange an animal he is. And Chesterton continues, it is exactly when we do regard man as an animal that we know that he is not an animal. The idea for Chesterton is to strike wherever possible this note of what is new and strange in the apologetic method. And for that reason, the style, even on so serious a subject, may sometimes be deliberately grotesque and fanciful, he says. For those of you that love Flannery O'Connor, you probably remember an echo of this in Flannery O'Connor. She's talking about the strategy of what she's trying to do apologetically as a Christian in her literary method. Listen to how much this sounds like Chesterton. This is just a P.S. When you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs as you do, she wrote, you can relax a little and use more normal ways of talking to it. But when you have to assume that it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures, which she certainly did in her stories. Anyhow, this strategy of making Christianity appear in a way as something new allowed non-Christians to come alongside Chesterton and listen. They were interested. We build truth together. We're all interested in it. Hopefully, this is Chesterton's angle. The other reason, I'm just going to cut this down to size and a little bit more quickly, but the other reason that Chesterton could show extraordinary personal kindness, as Wells put it, in his apologetic, especially you'll see when talking about Catholicism, was that he struggled and thought through and prayed through his consideration of the claims of the Catholic Church for a very long period. You know, Hilaire Belloc has a great essay where he talks about Chesterton's consistency and just patience and long-standing thinking through the Catholic faith. It was a remarkable thing to Belloc that Chesterton finally did convert. Belloc thought maybe he's just going to be thinking about this till the day he dies. But Chesterton prayed through and thought through the claims of the Catholic Church for many, many years. And as you may know, part of this struggle, as his good biographers have noted, was that Chesterton's wife, Frances, did not have any inclination of becoming a Catholic. You remember what Father Hetzler said about what she had said, I'm never going to cut my hair off and I'm never going to become a Catholic. His wife, Frances, was very opposed to the concept of the Catholic Church. She didn't have any inclination of becoming a Catholic through that entire long process of Chesterton thinking about the Catholic Church. Not even an inkling of it. And he converted to the Catholic faith, as you know, in 1922. Add to that reality that it took his wife, Frances, 4 more years to be received into the Catholic Church. She was in 1926. A step, by the way, that she always insisted was definitely her own doing, not a blind following of her husband on this matter of faith. She always said that to people. They said, "How come you converted?" And she would say, "Let me just preface my remarks by saying I didn't do it because my husband did it." Very interesting. The fact that their closeness to each other throughout their married life was such an important part of Chesterton's whole consciousness. You get a Chesterton who is thinking and writing and speaking about the claims of Christianity, and especially the claims of the Catholic Church, who is not only humble but charitable. Just as intellectuals in his life who believe very different things is a call on his part as an apologist to humility, to intellectual humility. So too is the reality of one's life partner, as in his case, not immediately following into the Catholic Church. It's a call on the part of the apologist to great charity. Because God is love, and the Catholic Church is our loving mother. And Christ the Lord said that the 2 great commandments are to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. So that when we get closer to God, when we get closer to the heart of the Church, we are finding deeper and deeper love. And thus there is an apparent paradox, especially this was true for Chesterton in his life, when the one we love, or the ones that we love, do not necessarily follow right away our movement towards what is for us greater love. Maybe you've experienced that in your own life with parents or children or spouses or siblings or whatever. But precisely because we are moving towards greater love in our very conversion, in our very spiritual journey, it's not just all about philosophy, but it's about love. It's all the more incumbent upon us in our apologetic to speak the truth, as Paul says, in love, to be, and Chesterton was this, to be infinitely patient in our apologetic, as Jesus has been infinitely patient with us when we were not yet Christians or when we were not yet in the true fold or whatever. When I think how much Chesterton loved his wife Frances, and when I think how Chesterton, on his long journey to the Catholic Church, did not really share his wife's trajectory, which was more, for Frances, it was more a position than a trajectory. She wasn't moving anywhere. I mean, that's how it was, and she made that very clear to him. I can see this situation, and you can see it in letters. One particular letter, I don't have time to quote, that Chesterton, on his way into the Catholic Church, wrote to Father Ronald Knox about his wife. I can see this situation as contributing vastly to Chesterton's spirit of a charitable apologetic. He has to be charitable to the one he knows best on this earth, to his wife. How much more does he need to be charitable to other people? He doesn't even know what their background is, what their situation is. He better be charitable to them as well. In that wonderful letter that Maisie Ward quotes in her biography, in which David Fagerberg, the Chesterton scholar at Notre Dame, refers to in his book, The Size of Chesterton's Catholicism, one can hear Chesterton approaching his friend. He wrote this letter to Maurice Baring, with the same spirit in which he approached his wife on this question of the church. And I think he's especially thinking about his wife here. This letter was written shortly after Chesterton's reception into the church. Maurice Baring had been received into the church years earlier, in 1909, I think. But here's this part of this letter that Chesterton writes, and he's especially talking about Anglo-Catholics like his wife. And notice the tone of this letter, because it's this humility and charity coming out. He says, I am shy of giving one of my deepest reasons for becoming a Catholic. He doesn't come in there breaking everything up. He's just saying, I'm shy about this. I'm shy of giving one of my deepest reasons because it is hard to put it without offense, and I am sure it is the wrong method to offend the wavering Anglo-Catholics. But I believe one of my strongest motives of becoming a Catholic was mixed up with the idea of honor. I feel there is something mean about not making complete confession and restitution after a historic error and slander. It is not the same thing to withdraw the charges against Rome one by one or restore the traditions to Canterbury one by one. Suppose a young prig refuses to live with his father or his friend or his wife because wine is drunk in the house or there are Greek statues in the hall. And suppose he goes off on his own and develops broader ideas. On the day he drinks his first glass of wine, I think it is essential to his honor that he should go back to his father or his friend and say, you are right, and I was wrong, and we will drink wine together. It is not consonant with his honor that he should set up a house of his own with wine and statues and every parallel particular, and still treat the other as if he were in the wrong. This is mean because it is making the best of both. It is combining the advantages of being right with the advantages of being wrong. Any analogy is imperfect, but I think you see what I mean. There in this letter is this humility and this charity, I think with his wife's particular and concrete situation in mind as an Anglo-Catholic. And notice what he's depending on for a person like that to convert. It's not going to be beating the person over the head, but it's going to be reminding a person of their honor. To be thinking the best of this person and saying, I know you're an honorable person. What would be the best thing to do given your difficult situation? Chesterton calls people in his apologetic to make heroic decisions, sometimes, for the truth and for love. And when it comes time for him to do it himself, he follows the truth in love. But he understands all too well that those we truly love may not be able to follow right away. That doesn't make the truth subjective. But those whom we love, their concrete situations demand of us the utmost charity. And that charity will bear fruit in the long run, no matter what happens. Defender of the faith, that's what he was called by the Pope. Chesterton moved in these circles that cultivated in him humility, and he moved in family circles that cultivated in him charity. And in humility and in charity he spoke, and he wrote the truth in love.